I just hate things less, sort of, I can't think of the word, strenuously than I did. I know I haven't got as big a chip about it because maybe I've escaped out of it.
By the late 1970s, John Lennon had stepped out of the maelstrom that had consumed his life for over a decade. He had been the leader of the Beatles, the man behind some of the most beloved music ever created, and a figure of rebellion who had become just as famous for his activism as for his lyrics.
All we are saying is give peace a chance.
But after years of fighting the pressures of fame, the ghosts of his childhood, and the demands of the world, Lennon found himself in a place he hadn't truly known since he was a boy. He was home. The city was New York, not Liverpool, and his life now revolved around Yoko Ono and their young son, Sean, rather than the stage and the studio. Yet, in its simplicity, it offered a peace he had long sought but never quite reached. His house husband phase, as he called it, was both a retreat and a revelation. It is this context that makes Double Fantasy, the last album Lennon would complete before his death, so poignant. It is the sound of a man who, after a career marked by defiance and reinvention, had finally surrendered to contentment. Yet the story behind its creation is not one of idyllic tranquility. It is a tale of separation and reconciliation, musical, emotional, and creative.
We have grown. We have grown.
For an album that would go on to win accolades and resonate with millions, it began as something deeply personal, almost fragile. By the time the Beatles disbanded, Lennon had already turned to Yoko Ono as both his artistic muse and emotional anchor. She had been vilified by fans who, desperate to find someone to blame for the band's collapse, painted her as the unwelcome outsider who had stolen Lennon away from his mates. But to Lennon, Ono was the partner he had been searching for all along, someone who could match him intellectually and artistically. She pushed him into areas of experimentation he had never considered during his time with the Beatles, introducing him to the avant-garde and freeing him from the constraints of pop songwriting. "I had been looking for her all my life," he once said, "and when I found her, I forgot everything else." Yet, as liberating as their relationship was in its early days, it was also chaotic. Their first musical collaborations produced a series of albums that baffled most listeners. Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins, Life with the Lions, and Wedding Album were as much conceptual art pieces as they were musical projects. They were raw, disjointed, and largely inaccessible to anyone outside of the experimental art scene. Those records weren't made for listening, one critic said bluntly. But that wasn't the point. To Lennon, the process itself was cathartic. It was about breaking down barriers and creating without fear of judgment. However, as the years wore on, that fearlessness began to yield diminishing returns. Albums like Sometime in New York City, which attempted to merge protest politics with rock, fell flat. What should have been a rallying cry sounded more like a clumsy sermon. "We were trying to change the world," Lennon admitted, but no one wanted to hear it. The failure of the record stung, but it also exposed cracks in their creative dynamic. Yoko had always been a polarizing figure, and by this point, her influence on Lennon's music was being scrutinized more harshly than ever. Their collaborative output was becoming messy, and Lennon, though still deeply in love with her, began to feel the weight of it. It was Yoko who suggested the break. She saw that Lennon was creatively lost, and instead of clinging to their shared projects, she encouraged him to find his own voice again. This led to the creation of Mind Games and Walls and Bridges, two albums that revealed a Lennon torn between independence and longing. Tracks like Isomasen, I'm Sorry, and What You Got are riddled with emotional conflict, as though he were trying to make peace with his need for both freedom and companionship. The pain of their temporary separation was evident, but so too was the growth that came from it. He was learning to stand on his own, though the shadow of Yoko was never far away. The mid-1970s were marked by further upheaval, including the infamous Lost Weekend, a period during which Lennon lived apart from Yoko and indulged in hedonistic excess. But by 1975, they had reconciled, and their lives took a quieter turn. With the birth of their son Sean, Lennon stepped back from music altogether. For 5 years, he dedicated himself to being a full-time father, cooking, baking bread, and watching his son grow. He called it the most fulfilling time of his life. For once, he said, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, I was just living. But creativity is not something Lennon could suppress forever. In 1980, during a sailing trip to Bermuda, inspiration struck. He found himself writing songs again, songs that reflected the serenity and maturity he had discovered in his years away from the public eye. When he returned to New York, he shared the material with Yoko, and the concept for Double Fantasy was born. The album would be a dialogue between them, a musical conversation about love, growth, and partnership. It was a diary of our lives, Yoko explained. We were showing people where we were at, after all we had been through. What made Double Fantasy unique, however, was the way it was recorded. Unlike their earlier collaborations, which often saw Ono present during Lennon's sessions and vice versa, this time they worked separately. Producer Jack Douglas, who had been brought on to oversee the project, described the process as a delicate balancing act. Those two could not work at the same time, he said. If she were there, it would have been impossible. I had to treat that album as 2 separate albums. Yoko from 11 o'clock until about 6:30 p.m. and then she would go home. John would come in at 7 p.m. and would work until about 1 or 2 in the morning. This separation was not a sign of estrangement, but of understanding. By working apart, they were able to give each other the space to fully explore their ideas without interference. Lennon's tracks, including Beautiful Boy and Woman, were deeply personal reflections on his love for his family and his gratitude for the life he had built with Ono. Woman is perhaps the most revealing, a song that Lennon described as a grown-up version of Girl. Where the Beatles' track had been tinged with longing and uncertainty, Woman was full of warmth and devotion. I can hardly express my mixed emotions, he sings, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had learned about love since the 1960s. Ono's contributions, often dismissed by critics, provided essential context for the album's narrative. Tracks like Yes, I'm Your Angel offered a playful counterpoint to Lennon's earnestness, reflecting the lightness that had returned to their relationship. While Lennon's songs were reflective and emotional, Ono's were more experimental, capturing the essence of a woman who had always embraced her individuality. Together, their tracks formed a back-and-forth dialogue, each one responding to the other and painting a picture of a couple who had found their rhythm again. One of the album's most poignant moments comes in Watching the Wheels, a song in which Lennon addresses the years he spent out of the spotlight. People say I'm crazy, he sings, doing what I'm doing. Well, they give me all kinds of warnings to save me from ruin. It is a defense of the choices he made, an assertion that his retreat from fame was not a failure, but a necessary step toward happiness. The song is both a confession and a celebration, a reminder that Lennon's greatest battles were often fought within himself. When Double Fantasy was released in November 1980, it was met with mixed reviews. Some critics dismissed it as sentimental, while others praised its honesty. What few could have predicted was that it would become Lennon's final statement. On the 8th of December 1980, just weeks after the album's release, Lennon was shot and killed outside his New York apartment building. The news sent shockwaves around the world, and Double Fantasy was quickly re-evaluated. What had initially been seen as a pleasant, if unremarkable, return to form was now viewed as a poignant farewell. In the aftermath of his death, the songs took on new meaning. Beautiful Boy, a tender lullaby written for Sean, became a heartbreaking reminder of the father who would no longer be there to watch his son grow up. Woman was transformed into a love letter frozen in time, a final expression of gratitude to the woman who had been his partner through it all. Even Ono's tracks, which had often been overlooked, were reassessed and recognized as vital pieces of the puzzle. Double Fantasy endures not because of its commercial success or its critical acclaim, but because it captures the essence of Lennon's journey. It is the sound of a man who, after years of turmoil, had found his way back to the things that mattered most. He wasn't trying to change the world anymore. He was simply living in it, cherishing the love he had fought so hard to protect. As the final notes of the album play, there is a sense of closure, but not of finality. Lennon's voice, full of warmth and sincerity, lingers long after the music stops. It is the voice of a man who had come full circle, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, steady work of healing and growth. Love is real, he sang once long ago, and in the end it was the most lasting message he left behind.